Great. So I think that we have a good audience in place, so we can get started on today's session. So welcome everyone again. Our webinar today will be focused on the gender and energy nexus within the climate blended finance market. And if we move to the next slide, I will get started on reviewing our agenda. So we do have a very packed agenda today. We're lucky to be joined by a number of expert speakers and expert panel. So just an overview of what you can expect over the next 90 minutes. So our webinar will begin with opening remarks from Ariane Dahan, who's a senior program specialist with the International Development Research Center, IDRC. So IDRC is a Canadian Crown corporation focused on supporting research and innovation for international development. And IDRC is also an anchor funder of the CCF Learning Hub and supported the stocktaking report on the energy gender nexus, which we'll be presenting findings on today. So we'll then spend some time walking through the CCF Learning Hub and key findings from our report, which will be followed by a Q&A session. We'll then move into our next presentation on practical insights on gender mainstreaming in climate finance vehicles from Nino Makatsaria, who's a gender consultant to the CCF. Then we'll get into our panel discussion. So we're lucky to have 4 expert speakers with us today for today's panel. So the panel will be moderated by Demetrio Innocenti, who's a climate lead at 2X Global, and we'll be joined by 4 panelists. So that includes Anne-Marie Lévesque, who's a director at FinDev Canada, Jeannette Gurung, founder and executive director of WOCAN, Lasitha Perera, CEO and co-founder of Greek Guarantee Company, and Moderator, founder and CEO at Beyond Finance. We'll then go into the Q&A with our panelists. We have about 25 minutes for a Q&A with the panel, and then we'll close out with some closing remarks. So I think with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Ariane Dahan with IDRC, to provide some opening remarks for us.
Thank you so much, Saisa, and thank you for making us part of that, and welcome and great to see. I'm trying to keep track of the number of participants. Has gone over 200 now. It's wonderful to see so many people for this important webinar. As Isa said, I work for the IDRC, the Canada's International Development Research Center, is a part of the Canadian Development Program that focuses on supporting research for development in the Global South. I'm based in Delhi. I work on a climate change program. This initiative and the collaboration is based in a program is called Supportive Inclusive Economies. Many of my colleagues are on the call, and in particular part of an initiative over the last 2 years that focuses on providing the evidence. And when I said provided evidence, we support local researchers to provide the evidence to help provide access to sustainable energy. And being part of the Canadian Development Program, we put a big focus on gender. And it's been an absolute delight and great promise to be partnering in that with CPI and with Convergence in this new facility. I think we are all aware, and the research that we support constantly shows that there is not enough finance for the needed climate action. The needs are becoming larger and larger. And while there's not enough funding available, not nearly enough of that funding goes to marginalized groups that typically are most impacted and have least access to finance. Many of the research that we support across the Global South provide that evidence over again, and it's that's why it's so particularly important to be working with CPI and with Convergence and with the many specialists that we will hear about in this webinar about what we can do to help ensure that the barriers that exist in providing the climate finance for access to climate action, and particularly energy, of course, in the context of this webinar, to be working with the industry leaders that you will hear from that. So once again, I said thank you for making us part of that. I am so so excited to see so many people have joined. Very much looking forward to hearing what the experts have to say. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Arian. So we'll move into an overview of the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility and a brief introduction to our Learning Hub, and then we'll get into the findings from our latest stocktaking report. So just as a brief introduction to the CCF, for those who aren't familiar with our facility and the Learning Hub, the CC facility is a joint partnership between Convergence and CPI, and the facility's purpose is really to accelerate the implementation of climate blended finance structures. So the facility does this through three components. So the facility provides both grant support as well as acceleration support to help climate finance structures mobilize private capital and ultimately launch in the market. And the third component, how we support blended climate structures, is through the Learning Hub. So the Learning Hub also is sort of the latest component to launch. And the hub is focused on providing evidence and best practices to support the implementation of blended climate vehicles. So the goal of the hub is really to identify and fill knowledge gaps and build and consolidate learnings for the field. So the hub draws on Convergence and CPI's data and research activities, as well as our experience supporting early stage climate finance vehicles, both through our design funding programs and the CPI Global Lab, really to provide practical guidance to practitioners and investors in climate finance. So the stocktaking report is our inaugural report for the hub. So we're very excited to be walking through our findings from that report today. So if we move to the next slide, I'll just give a little bit of background on the Gender Energy Nexus and why we use this as the jumping off point for the research that the hub will be looking at. So we decided to focus on the intersection of gender and energy because we recognize that gender responsiveness is underrepresented within the climate market overall. So in the report, we'll walk through some of the general trends within the gender climate nexus of the blended finance market. But we note that this is particularly evident within the energy sector. So gender responsiveness is even less common within energy compared to other climate sectors. However, given the size of the energy sector, so the energy sector is almost half of all climate finance and also half of all blended finance, which really means that there's a huge opportunity to integrate a gender lens as the energy market embarks on a green transition. So how we're classifying gender responsiveness is really across the energy value chain. So we're looking at women in leadership positions, technical roles within the labor force, and also as end users within the report. So I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Robin Ivory, who will take us through some of the key data findings from the report. So Robin, I'll hand it over to you as well. And I'll just note that the report is now live on our website, and it will sort of look at three different sections. So we look at an overview of the key data trends, which Robin will look at. We also look at 5 case studies of transactions that are addressing gender responsiveness and also using blended finance to address the energy sector. And then we'll finish with some challenges and recommendations, which William and myself will walk through later. So Robin, I'll hand it over to you next to go through some of the data findings.
Great. Thank you very much, Aisha, and hello to everyone today. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start us off by looking at some of the high-level trends that we've seen in the gender-responsive climate blended market. All of the data that I'll be reviewing is sourced from Convergence's Historical Deals Database, or HDD, which has captured over 1,200 blended finance transactions to date. So when we look at all transactions in the HDD, as Aisha mentioned, those that focus on climate specifically account for about 50% of the deals. So that means deals that focus on adaptation, mitigation, or a combination of both, which is known as hybrid deals. The graph that you see represents those climate blended deals. And of those, 78% have no gender focus, while 17% have at least gender disaggregated data, and only 5% have an intentional gender focus. So the vast majority of climate blended transactions are not considered gender responsive. In general, climate adaptation tends to have a higher proportion of gender responsive deals than either mitigation or hybrid. Moving on, we can see the market growth of gender responsive climate transactions shown in light green versus the whole climate market, which is the dark blue bars, and that's just by cumulative deal count. Over the past decade, gender-responsive climate deals have seen a gradual increase, while in contrast, climate deals overall have experienced a more pronounced growth. While it's encouraging that investors are increasingly interested in supporting transactions with a climate focus, we're not seeing consideration for gender keep pace. Another way to look at the growth of these markets is by looking at the total amount of finance committed to those deals. So if we move to the next slide, you can once again see the breakdown of those climate transactions. So we're just going to move one slide over. Thank you. And this is the breakdown of the climate transactions. And these are, again, gender aware versus those that are gender responsive by aggregate finance. And once again, the financing for gender responsive climate deals have not kept pace. And aggregate financing for these deals has actually declined slightly from USD 5 billion between 2018 and 2020 to USD 4.8 billion between 2021 and 2023. So with all of this, our first data takeaway on the next slide is that gender responsive climate blended transactions, and especially those that are intentionally gender focused, are underrepresented and underfunded, and their growth rate is slower than the overall climate market. And now we'll take a look at how gender responsive climate transactions are generally structured. So on the next slide, you'll see the 5 different vehicles which are typical of blended finance transactions, namely funds, projects, companies, blended bonds, and facilities. The gender responsive climate bonds are mostly structured as funds and projects. However, projects receive the most amount of funding. The projects are largely in off-grid and large-scale renewable energy. On the next slide, you can see regarding the type of concessional financing used within gender-responsive climate transactions, concessional capital is most frequently used, followed by technical assistance. And debt has been the most common form of concessional capital, namely subordinated debt followed by senior debt. And this leads us to the second key data point on the next slide, which is that while funds are the most commonly used vehicle, projects attract the most financing, with concessional debt being the most popular blended finance archetype. And lastly, we're going to zoom in a little and look at within the climate transactions to pull out some trends from the energy sector specifically. So this graph shows the breakdown of gender responsive versus non-gender aware, but this time only for the energy transactions. And as Aisha mentioned, energy represents the largest sector within our climate data. So fossil fuels and on-grid energy both only have a very small proportion, 11%, of deals that focus on gender, while capital markets and carbon credits and off-grid renewables have higher proportions. On-grid utility scale energy deals face unique barriers that make them less likely to be gender responsive. So for example, large-scale renewable energy development often takes place in the form of project finance, where investors are removed from the underlying policies influencing gender outcomes. And this leads us to our last takeaway on the next slide, that gender responsiveness is more common in the off-grid renewable energy sector than large-scale on-grid projects. So this is just a very high-level snapshot of some of the data we look at within the report. We cover far more data trends, including investor data within the report, so I do encourage you to give it a read. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to William Wallach from CPI, who will look at further aspects of the report.
Thank you, Robin. In addition to an analysis of gender responsiveness using Convergence's HGD, we also conducted an analysis of financial instruments using 2X criteria. If you could go to the previous slide, please. Since 2018, 2X criteria has evolved as a global standard for gender finance. Hundreds of companies and investors are already using the 2X standard to set their gender policies and guide action. The 2X criteria addresses gender-responsive finance across 6 dimensions, with 5 being shown on the graph being shown, and the 6th being portfolio-level action. To understand how climate finance structures are using 2X criteria, CPI and Convergence identified a list of 59 financial structures that are gender-responsive and either build climate resilience or contribute towards climate mitigation. An instrument was tagged with one of the 5 2X criteria categories if the language in its gender policy matched the description of one of the categories. Tagging was not exclusive. Interviews with industry experts revealed that the products and services category is often the easiest to implement within the climate space, since many climate products and services already disproportionately benefit women. Whereas the supply chain category is often the least commonly implemented in the climate space because gender-responsive procurement policies are often considered outside the purview of fund managers. These trends were particularly pronounced for instruments that were analyzed that invest in the energy sector. Now on to the next slide, where we will discuss the major challenges identified in the reports. The data analysis that we conducted, in addition to interviews with stakeholders in the gender energy space, led us to identify 4 main challenges to gender-responsive investments. First, despite the success of emerging standards such as 2X, there's still a lack of standardized metrics for gender-responsive investments. This makes it difficult for investors to set reasonable targets, and at the same time, difficulties in collecting useful disaggregated data and context-specific needs of different investments can make global metrics neither useful nor relevant. Second, there is a focus on short-term outputs, such as number of jobs created for women, and less on longer-term objectives, such as livelihood transformation. This is both because longer-term objectives are more difficult to achieve and measure, and because short funding cycles require measurable outputs where long-term objectives don't fit in. Third, interviews revealed that there are often 2 silos of investors: gender lens investors and climate investors. This is especially the case for smaller funds that do not possess large technical assistant facilities, or for institutions with limited resources that have to prioritize impact measurement and monitoring. And finally, fourth, gender lens investments often fail to achieve their goal due to systematic barriers, such as disproportionately high representation of women in the informal economy, or the fact that women do not have access to traditional forms of finance due to a lack of collateral. These are the 4 major challenges that we identified in the report. And now back to Aisha for the report's recommendations.
Great, thanks, William. So I'll spend a little bit of time highlighting a few of the recommendations that we make in our report, although we won't touch on all of them during this session. So what were some of the highlights and recommendations that we have for the field? So first is for concessional capital providers and really recognizing the importance of acceleration support and design funding grants in supporting practitioners and particularly first-time deal sponsors and fund managers to achieve gender outcomes. So our findings demonstrate that the importance of grant support is very important early within transaction design. So we recognize that applying a gender lens within climate vehicles can be very costly and resource intensive. And this is particularly true in the energy sector, where the link is not always explicit with gender. So interviews with our grantees revealed how early stage support allowed them to collect baseline data, develop gender action plans, and reporting frameworks, amongst other things. Our second recommendation in terms of instruments that are particularly beneficial when supporting gender and mainstreaming gender within climate vehicles is TA and financial incentives and deploying these together to achieve complementary goals. So we found that TA and financial incentives, so for example, in the form of performance-based performance-linked payments, can be mutually reinforcing. So, for example, TA here is used to develop the appropriate gender targets and metrics, and then financial incentives, such as an interest rate reduction for loans, provides a powerful incentive to project sponsors and investees to achieve targets. So we noted in a couple of our case studies that those 2 instruments can be used in a very mutually reinforcing way. The third recommendation is to seek opportunities to monetize gender as a co-benefit of climate vehicles. So one finding was that we really recognize that it is difficult to garner market demand for gender as a standalone outcome. But there is a big opportunity to monetize gender as a co-benefit of climate projects. So we look at a couple case studies here. So we look at the Clean Impact Bond, which is the development impact bond created by Sistema Bio that issues gender credits. We also talk a little bit about W+ credits, which Jeannette from WOCAN can speak about a little bit more during the panel discussion. And then our last finding is really where future research should be focused. So one of those findings is really the need to understand more what market demand and pricing for gender benefits should be. But really, in order to effectively monetize gender, we need research that looks at the impact of gender outcomes and information on the size of the market and willing buyers. We generally need more linkages between the research community and blended finance practitioners to make this link relevant, and also to gather the relevant data and determine the best metrics to put this in place. So part of the work that we'll be focusing on in the hub is also to make that link much more enforced between research and practitioners. So with that, that's just 4 of the recommendations from our report. We touch on a couple more. But for the sake of time, I think what we'll do now is move a little bit into a 5-minute Q&A. So please feel free to submit any questions you might have into the Q&A box. We'll just leave a couple minutes for questions. But maybe we'll start off with one question here, which is talking about where we see funder demand for gender lens investing in the blended finance market. So that's a good question. So one of the exercises that we do in the report is we look at who the most frequent investors and funders of gender lens vehicles in the blended finance market have been. So we have a couple league tables that look at the top public, philanthropic, and private investors. So our data finds that, not surprisingly, public and philanthropic investors have been the most common investors in blended finance transactions that are addressing both climate and gender goals. I guess this isn't surprising that a lot of that focus is being championed from the public sector, particularly DFIs and development agencies. I will note that every transaction that we look at in this report that are blended include a private investor. So all these deals do have private interest. It's just that we don't necessarily see the most repeat investments, which would garner enough activity to register on a league table, for example, coming from the private sector. Although we do note that gender is increasingly becoming a consideration, if not a requirement, from the investment community. So we have one question. We have a couple questions on sort of the 2x analysis, how we went about looking at instruments, and sort of what some of those numbers represent. So William, I might pass it over to you to give a little bit more context on how we went about doing that analysis.
Sure. Thank you so much, Aisha. So the way that the analysis was done is that we identified financial instruments that were gender responsive and were climate focused, so either adaptation or mitigation focused. And we looked at their gender policies and saw how they were targeting gender, whether across 2x's different criteria. And so part of the reason that products and services were so high is because in most of these policies, they were saying that their products or services, whether it be supporting renewable energy generation or clean cooking, was all that these were disproportionately benefiting women. And so this was a common criteria that we saw across the different gender policies for the instruments that we analyzed. We did not then go and validate that they were achieving their metrics, but we were just looking at their gender policies out of curiosity for what are the different types of criteria that gender responsive instruments are targeting.
Thanks, William. That's helpful. We had another question thinking about some of our methodology also with how we looked at also gender lens investments in our analysis. So Robin, maybe you could give a little bit of background on how we went about classifying what gender responsiveness within climate finance vehicles look like.
Sure, thanks, Aisha. So we at Convergence within the HDD, we do classify each of our transactions as either having no gender awareness, as having some gender focus, and the minimum requirement of that is having gender disaggregated data and being intentionally gender focused with a lens. So that data is based on public release and information made available by deal sponsors or investors of a deal. And then they are subsequently undergo due diligence by Convergence staff to ensure that they are indeed aligning with our criteria. So we have those 1, 2, 3 criteria. And again, this is based on an already established assessment method. So we do base it on the gender equality coding system by DAC. And we've looked and worked with organizations such as 2X as well to refine our methods. So that's how we kind of went about the classification and the methodology behind gender responsiveness.
Thanks, Robin. So I see another question a little bit about how we see investors looking at gender responsiveness amongst other objectives. So one thing we noted when we looked at our league table was that gender responsiveness had sort of a more limited view. It looked at women and girls in particular, but we note that gender equity includes looking at other marginalized groups, and power structures. Other metrics such as racial equity play a role. So when we looked at how many of the funders had more of an intersectional lens, it was quite limited. It was only maybe 1 or 2 funders in the league table. So I think that it sort of reflects where the community is at in terms of thinking about gender lens investing, thinking about gender within the energy and sector overall. That we're still not seeing, still preliminary in terms of sometimes having a full intersectional lens. And I think that also reflects what's sort of doable for sponsors and fund managers at the moment. So that's sort of one reflection I would have in terms of how many indicators were usually being tracked when it came to gender lens investing. So I note that we're right about time to move on to the next part of this presentation, but we'll continue to look at the chat and answer questions during the presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nino Matkatsaria at CPI, who's a gender consultant for CPI, to speak through some of her insights on how to go about gender mainstreaming in climate finance vehicles. So Nino, over to you.
Thank you for introduction, Aisha, and good day, everyone. As Aisha mentioned, I'm a gender consultant to CC Facility on behalf of Climate for Action LLC, my firm, which specializes in supporting clients to design and fundraise for innovative climate finance solutions, including for gender mainstream vehicles. Given the 10-minute agenda, we will share 7 practical insights to integrating gender considerations across climate finance solutions, especially during the design stage. Next slide, please. So as advice number 1, and as a first step, we advise entities to decide on their level of gender ambition. Now, this is important as often we're approached by entities who would like to integrate gender considerations, but don't know where to start. So broadly speaking, we categorize the gender ambition in one of the 4 categories below. And this is more or less aligned to the findings of the report earlier. Also, this is our proprietary data. So first is the highest level of gender ambition is gender equity as a key outcome investment thesis. Here we mean intentionally gender-focused vehicles with gender equality and women economic empowerment as key outcome and investment strategy of financial solutions, and where at least 51% of capital is allocated towards projects with specific gender-focused result areas. So there's gender-focused result management frameworks there. So as I said, this is the highest level of gender ambition, and we usually recommend this approach to experienced sponsors in gender lens investing versus first-time sponsors who are new to gender theme. Next, down the slide is effective gender mainstreaming category. Here we mean climate finance solutions where gender equality is not the key outcome, but where it is a significant part of climate finance solution impact areas and result management frameworks of projects downstream, so projects funded by the facility. Such an approach typically requires context-specific gender analysis and gender action plan to address identified barriers and capitalize on opportunities in targeted countries of operations, as well as dedicated resources such as annual budget and expertise to advance gender equality. Most of the solutions with effective gender mainstreaming on the market, they also have specific selection criteria, such as gender lens investing criteria, as well as portfolio allocation strategy, meaning that on average, 20 to 30% of capital is allocated towards projects with gender-focused result areas. Notice that this allocation of percentage is lower than under gender as key theme, with the highest ambition. And next is gender equity as co-benefit by default. We mean here climate finance solutions that by nature contribute to gender equality, but operate with limited financial resources and design features, such as gender analysis. They don't have any specific gender action plan or gender strategy. For example, climate finance solutions that provides access to solar home systems in rural areas by default will contribute to gender equity where electrification is still a luxury, right? So gender as a co-benefit ambition is usually a starting point for many climate finance vehicle promoters who have limited capacity or resources to mainstream gender. It should be also highlighted, and it's an important point to keep in mind, that you can start with lower gender ambition and gradually progress to effective gender mainstreaming over time. So it's you can deploy a phased approach to gender mainstreaming in your strategy. On the next slide, please. So for the purposes, previous slide. So for the purposes of this presentation, we will be focusing on effective gender mainstreaming strategy. At Climate for Action, we define gender mainstreaming as a process that seeks to have gender equity and the needs of women and men to be identified and acknowledged and addressed in the design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation stages of climate finance vehicles and projects downstream. At each step, we recommend how to integrate these considerations, bringing the case study in the later slides. But it should be highlighted that our understanding of gender in this presentation is non-binary and intersectional. That's important to note. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we'll be talking about critical inputs for effective gender mainstreaming. So first critical input and first step is gender analysis, which is basically a study that identifies key gender gaps and opportunities in countries to identify your climate finance solution. It looks both at quantitative, like sex disaggregated data, as well as qualitative data, including like systematic barriers that were mentioned previously, and is a first step to inform your gender ambition and strategy going forward of how you're going to integrate gender across your investment vehicles and projects downstream. Now, resources is very important to note and critical input to shape your gender ambition. Typically, effective gender mainstreaming requires dedicated gender expertise and annual budget for gender mainstreaming. And to be honest, this is, when we talk to clients, this is the most overlooked input during the planning process, like design stage, as the activities are rarely costed out. And there's like not really a dedicated plans to allocate a dedicated gender expertise from our experience. So once you perform the gender analysis to identify context-specific gaps and opportunities in your countries of operations, and once you find out what is your available resources, your level of gender ambitions that you identified initially may be adjusted. So accountability is also critical for effective gender mainstreaming, and as a best practice, we recommend a highest level of oversight for gender mainstreaming, ideally at the level of the board or investment committee, whichever is the highest. This is to have overall oversight. And of course, you would also ideally have a dedicated gender expert on the team. On the next slide, we discuss, next slide, please. So we discuss critical output for effective gender mainstream during the design stage of your investment vehicle. And this is Gender Action Plan, which is a forward-looking strategy to mainstream gender at the level of investment vehicles and ideally projects financed by it. Now notice that we use the term fit for purpose because Gender Action Plan is largely informed by context-specific gender analysis findings in your targeted countries of operations and tailored to your financial governance, operational structure of your financial vehicle, including your resource availability, as well as capital allocation and the instruments available. So this is important to note, all of this before you start working on your gender action plan. And as I said previously, gender analysis is the first step. Now, in terms of, I would like to also one more time highlight the importance of the grant instrument on the next slide. Can we move to the, let's skip this slide, please. As a critical insight, I would really like to advise everyone to utilize grant instrument for effective gender mainstreaming if you decided to do so, because what we have seen is that most of the projects that we work with basically really, especially during implementation stage, that's where you operationalize your investment vehicle. They lack resources, like funding sources, to implement and promote gender equality, right, across their investment vehicles, project and direct beneficiaries. So I would really urge you to incorporate grant instrument and set up perhaps a dedicated technical assistance facility in your blended finance structures already from design stage. And this is one of the best practices that successful vehicles that mainstream gender have done before, and where we have supported before as well. And acceleration support, as noted by Aisha and the team, is quite important as well, especially to help you integrate gender into the design stage, as given the typically limited resources and expertise and experience of project sponsors or climate investment vehicle promoters. And catalytic climate finance facility provides such acceleration support. And we will discuss type of support provided in consequent slides. So again, as key highlights, utilize grant instrument, especially as a TA during implementation phase. On the next slide, I would like to also highlight that growing number of public and institutional investors are active in gender climate nexus financing, as seen from this slide. And actually incorporating gender considerations in your finance, climate finance solution can boost your fundraising strategy. So keep this in mind. On the next slide also, as advice number 6, we would like to share most used gender responsive impact areas by climate finance solutions in the gender action plan. So those are increased access to clean energy, especially for underserved communities in rural areas. Improved affordability of energy is also one of the mostly cited impact areas. Women economic empowerment and participation. Of course, there's job creation and income generation, but also the one area that is often overlooked but can be encouraged based on our practical insight and experience is to build women competency and capacity to allow for their career progression to senior level positions in energy sector, because sector is largely dominated by men. So also opportunities for energy-based livelihoods is critical impact areas that you can think through. As an example, evidence shows that rural electrification can significantly raise female employment and enable micro enterprises, as well as create more time for productive educational and leisure activities for women and girls. Access to education, access to healthcare facilities can be also one of the activities that can be enabled under this impact area on energy-based livelihoods. And last but not least, on the next slide, I would like to highlight that effective gender mainstreaming goes beyond design stage. As a matter of fact, gender mainstreaming process broadly, as I mentioned before, evolves around 3 main steps of climate finance program cycles. This is design, implementation, which is operationalization, and monitoring and evaluation. And based on the case study of Lightsmith Group for its climate resilience and adaptation finance and technology transfer facility, we would like to discuss some of the best practices of how to mainstream gender across climate finance facility. So during design stage, as I said, critical inputs are gender action plan. And for example, Lightsmith Group performed gender analysis to inform its gender action plan as a first stage, and then developed a time-bound gender action plan with clearly defined activities, timelines, responsibilities, and budget. For implementation, operationalization stage, Lightsmith Group, and this is also the best practice, developed the gender policy to demonstrate its written institutional commitment to gender equality and women economic empowerment. And it also operationalized gender equitable participation of women and men through its investment process, procurement process, recruitment process, strategies and plans. So it's very important that if you decide to go with effective gender mainstreaming, you need to look into where in your processes you can integrate gender. And as the last, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, what Lightsmith Group did is that they developed and management gender responsive monitoring and evaluation framework with specific indicators, as well as institutionalized reporting on gender metrics for its portfolio to investors and stakeholders. So on a final slide, I would like to discuss that and share some insights of where catalytic climate finance facility can support, especially through acceleration support. So it enables access to specific gender expertise, and some of the support requested to date by grantees, because the support is requested can be customized to your needs, to grantees' needs, is basically can be broadly grouped under following categories, which is gender analysis, gender equality strategy development, gender action plan development, gender-less investment strategy criteria and tools development, alignment to international benchmarks such as 2X criteria, which was discussed before presentation, and guidance on setting gender-related KPIs. So this is broadly the support that can be provided, but as I said, it can be fit for purpose and customized. And if you have any questions from this presentation, please ask in the chat and we will respond, I think, in the chat as we only had 10 minutes. So thank you. I hope I fit in this 10 minutes and thank you for listening. We are here to respond to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Nino, for that. And yes, please do ask your questions in the chat and we'll continue to get through those. But now I'm pleased to bring on board our panel. So I'll hand it over to Demetrio Innocenti to give an introduction to our panelist. He's a climate lead with 2X Global and will be moderating the panel. So Demetrio, I'll hand the mic over to you to get started on the panel.
Thank you, Ayesha. And you already introduced me. I'm the climate lead at 2X Global, and truly a pleasure to be with all of you today. So, and of course, my thank goes to Convergence, CPI colleagues, the entire Catalytic Climate Finance Facility team for inviting 2X to moderate this remarkable and high-level panel discussion on gender and climate investing. Well, first, let me tell you something about 2X Global. We have mentioned several times the 2X criteria. For those of you that do not know yet 2X Global, 2X is a global membership and field-building organization focused on keeping and engaging the full spectrum of investors, intermediaries, innovators who are capable of transforming systems of finance through gender-smart deployment of capital across asset classes and markets. Many of the speakers and participants today are actually members of 2X Global. Several of them apply or are applying the so-called 2X criteria in their investment decisions, which indeed are the criteria that today are setting the standards of what can be considered gender smart investing. And I understand that indeed also from some of the panelists today, we can hear a little bit about the application in their investments. 2X is also the manager of the USAID-led Climate and Gender Equity Fund, CGEF, which in some aspects shares similar objectives with the Catalytic Climate Finance Facility. CGEF ultimately seeks to unlock capital through its concessional finance, which can be invested in actions and solutions that ultimately will produce impact at scale on climate and gender equity. Also, like Convergence and CPI, 2X Global participates to the IDRC-supported Clean Energy for Development Call for Action. All right, now it's time to start our panel discussion, and then we will interactively receive your question through the chat for our distinguished panelists. We will read your questions and give you the floor to the panel member that you are targeting to reply. I will moderate this session by asking 2 rounds of questions to each of our panelists, who will have more or less 3 or 4 minutes to reply to each of my questions. And after that, we will open the question and answer session. I will introduce you each of the panelists before asking the first question. Let's get started. Our first panelist is Lasitha Perera and Las. Las is the CEO of the Green Guarantee Company, GGC, who is the world's first climate-focused guarantor, which has the missions to mobilize more climate finance from global capital markets into emerging markets. Las was previously the CEO at the Garant Co. and also had the roles of Chief Investment Officers and Executive Director. Las, first question to you. Can you please share with us the process for developing GGC's Gender Action Plan, including the upstream process, meaning determining relevant consideration for climate sector, and downstream, how you implement it with investors and borrowers? The floor is yours, Las.
Thank you, Demetrio, and thank you to Convergence and CPI for giving me the opportunity to speak on this subject. But in terms of our journey to integrate a gender lens into our investment process, we really had the benefit of the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the anchor investors in the Green Guarantee Company. So very early in our discussions with them around making an investment, they brought up the need to make sure that the transactions that we were looking at were gender responsive, as well as having a high climate impact. So from the very outset, this was something that we started to integrate into a transaction scorecard that we were developing, and as a consequence, there was a lot of iteration between us and the gender team at the Green Climate Fund to make sure that we were capturing all the relevant sort of indicators that would be necessary to make sure that we were picking the right transactions, both from a climate perspective, but obviously from a gender responsive perspective as well. And those kind of indicators, speak a lot to what Nino was talking about. It was really around the level of commitment you see from the governance structure of a borrower that we might be finding a guarantee to, all the way through to how they might be engaging with women in their supply chains, not just within their company, obviously, but in terms of giving them access and to opportunity and empowerment, but also outside in terms of the impact it might be having, as I mentioned, through supply chains, but also through the impact the project might be having in the context of the environment in which it's situated as well. So this is a pillar within this transaction scorecard that our teams have to review through the due diligence process and make sure that there's a level of confidence. And as a startup, we have minimal resources, right? We don't have necessarily the resources that a big development finance institution might have. So we've had to think smart about how we do this. And one of the ways that we've integrated gender expertise into our investment process is by having independent members on our investment committee. And actually, we have a separate impact committee to our investment committee. So we have an investment committee that looks at the financial aspects of a transaction, and then we have an impact committee that sits separately to focus on the impact aspects of a transaction. And on that impact committee, we have individuals that have expertise, from a gender responsive perspective as well, which is very helpful because that gives our team a sounding board they can use during the due diligence process. And when we get to the committee, there's a robust discussion around this as well to make sure we're making the right decisions before we move ahead as well. In terms of then implementing it with the borrowers, once we, as well as us having our own gender action plan, one of the requirements we have for our borrowers is that if they do not have a gender action plan, they commit to putting one in place, and that that will become part of the reporting requirement for us to provide them with a guarantee. And their compliance with that, will be one of the covenants that they put within the financial documentation. So effectively, they're saying, if we do not do this, we will be in breach of the financial documentation, right? So that's quite serious. So it's a serious obligation from the borrower to make sure that they are delivering on that gender action plan as we go through. Our job going forwards in terms of managing that relationship is to make sure that, in a lot of cases, lack of compliance may come directly to a lack of capacity to comply. And it's our ability to make sure we can spot that in advance, try and help them access technical assistance funding where that's available, and try and support them through that journey themselves as well. I read on 2X's website that, gender impact investing is a journey. I think you say somewhere very prominently, and I think that is the case for us as well as it is the case for the borrowers that we're dealing with. And so, we have to be sensitive to that and support them through that journey. But that's fundamentally the key elements of it is, internally, it's about making sure that we meet the criteria on our scorecard, which is important to our shareholders like the GCF, having the right resources, even if we can't have them permanently, having them within the governance structure of our decision making to make sure that there's somebody that can give us guidance, and then fundamentally working with our clients to make sure that we support them on their journey through that.
Thank you, Las, and indeed, thanks for sharing this first-hand experience on even how to enact gender action plans into into action through their mainstreaming into legal documents. And I'm going to our second panelist. It's really a pleasure to introduce you Anne-Marie Lévesque from FinDev Canada. Anne-Marie is the director of the Impact Strategy and Thought Leadership at FinDev, and her team leads on the development of and enhancement, actually, of FinDev Canada's strategies and tools to promote its development impact priorities. Her team is also responsible for generating and disseminating insights on the impact of FinDev Canada's investments. So a pleasure to have you with us, Anne-Marie. And the first question we would like to ask you is, if you could please share how FinDev incorporates a climate and gender lens within your investment process, including actually the 2X criteria, and how you determine the gender ambition and targets across different projects. The floor is yours.
Of course, thank you, Demetrio. Yes, no, happy to talk a little bit about this. As you mentioned, FinDev Canada is Canada's development finance institution. We've been around since 2018, right around the same time as the 2X Challenge, actually. So we provide debt, equity, guarantees, and blended finance, as well as technical assistance to private sector clients in Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and now the Indo-Pacific region as well. And we do this to promote our 3 development impact priorities, which are climate and nature action, gender equality, and market development. So to answer your first question, you will have noticed, so climate and gender are 2 of our top development impact priorities. And for us, we really we've been intentional about not considering them in silos. So really we consider them as interconnected and mutually reinforcing. And so that's why we screen 100% of our transactions from both a climate and a gender lens. Now that doesn't mean that all our clients need to do both and perform really well or reach a certain threshold across both. But we do systematically look for opportunities, gaps in both areas. And we do this through our development impact tool, which embeds a climate mitigation, adaptation, and nature component, as well as a gender equality module, which, as you mentioned, does use the 2X criteria. We are early adopters of the 2X criteria, and we've also over time added other things. So we've built around the 2X criteria for our own internal gender assessment. But the fact that this incorporation in a standard tool that we use systematically across our transactions, we call that hardwiring. So the fact that we've hardwired gender and climate in our processes from the beginning has really helped us because it means that we don't need to run a separate gender analysis, or we need to run a separate climate analysis on top of our standard impact analysis for transactions, right? It just becomes part of how we do business. So over time, you really reap the benefits because you build the muscle to assess transactions both from a gender and climate lens, and you build the muscle to talk about it internally and externally with clients as well. So how do we, and then to your second question, how do we go from there, right? Like when we have this assessment, that's just step 1. When we have the knowledge, then what do we do with it? And how do we determine the ambition with clients? So first, it's really about meeting clients where they are, right? And it's been mentioned earlier today and also by Las, but what would make sense in their context? What would be the most impactful and sustainable change, right? So we have a mindset of change, transformational activities that could happen in the context of that investment. So it's not always about big representation targets or big changes in the numbers. It can be, but also in some cases, those type of targets can even be, in my opinion, counterproductive if the right enablement is not in place, right, to successfully achieve these targets. So we're trying to have, especially in more challenging sectors, such as off-grid energy, sustainable infrastructure in general, small steps can pay more or interesting dividends in the long run, right? And maybe Well, an example, I have a couple examples. I know I saw earlier that one of our funds is, one of the funds we're invested in is on the line. I saw Claire Cummings was commenting, I think Climate Investor One is a great example of a fund that had an amazing journey when it comes to incorporating a gender lens throughout their operations. And maybe another example I'll give, which focuses on blended finance specifically, is Gaia, which is a blended finance, a 1.5 billion blended finance platform that FinDev Canada has put together in partnership with MUFG, among others, which will provide climate finance, concessional or blended climate finance in 25 countries. And so we don't have a preconceived idea of what type of gender ambition each of these projects will have, but we already know that 100% of these projects will be asked to develop a gender action plan. So we already know that some will be more ambitious than others, but all will move the needle. And we will have also a technical assistance facility to support clients and projects in this area, which I know we'll probably get to a little bit later.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and congrats for indeed your investment in Climate Investor One and Gaia, and it's very good practice of gender smart investing. And I would then now introduce you the third panelist. It's really a pleasure to have Maud Monet with us today. Maud brings over 30 years of experience in ESG, impact investment, international development in the private and public sector in emerging markets. Maud is the founder of Behind Finance Consulting, which is a consulting company supporting asset owners and asset managers implementing a strategy in impact investing. She is the senior advisor in Asia for the GIIN, the Global Impact Investment Network that you all know, strengthening the impact investing community and building engagement with institutional investors. And she's also a member of several investment committees. Maud is a very strong supporter of gender lens investing. In 2021, Behind Finance Consulting has designed an award-winning fund dedicated to gender and climate resilience in emerging markets, which is supported by Convergence and was presented at the COP28 last year. Until July 2020, Maud grew successfully responsibility as a regional director in Asia Pacific as one of the world's leading asset managers in ESG and impact investments. Maud, let me ask you the first question. Can you please comment on the impetus for Behind Finance facility and the need for better designed financial products within their climate portfolio with gender lens? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Demetrio. And first, I'd like to say we are still implementing this fund project, but we have also reached a very important milestone, and I'd like to share it with you today, given the support that Convergence gave us through these 2 rounds of grant. So we are in final stage of exclusive negotiation with a partner who has agreed to be named today. So I'm very proud to announce that we are partnering with the Grameen Credit Agricole Foundation, and we are really delighted because it's a pioneer in financial inclusion with a specific focus on women and rural financing, so really at the core of our investment thesis. I'd like to comment on what the previous speaker has said about silos between gender and climate, something we are actually trying to address. And also the fact that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change, but also that they can benefit disproportionately from gender mainstream solution. Actually, we couldn't agree more. It's really at the heart of our investment thesis. And I would even argue it's not only women, it's also their family and their community, as women are early adopters of climate solutions, so they can disseminate best practices to the community. However, to achieve that, you need to hear the voice of women and the solutions that women need. And it's really at the heart of our fund project. So maybe let me explain you where we come from. Camille, with my partner on the line as well, and we have sourced transaction in emerging markets for many years. We have met with many people in remote and rural communities, and obviously many women. And if you belong to these communities in emerging markets, and particularly if you are a woman, it means you have no or less access to affordable clean water, to affordable clean energy, to climate smart solution in sustainable agriculture. It also means you have no or less access to bank account, to financial products, and certainly to product and services contributing to climate resilience. As women, you are underrepresented in business, in decision-making bodies, and particularly when it comes to environmental issues. Your needs and preferences for product and services in agriculture, in water access, in energy access are poorly known and poorly addressed. And it leads to a loss of development opportunities, but also of business opportunities and a lesser impact of climate adaptation solution. So it's really our belief, which is part of the design of the fund, to design this fund for, by, and with women to succeed in climate adaptation. So how do we plan to achieve it? We focus on key sectors that are actually disproportionately benefiting women and climate adaptation. These sectors are sustainable agriculture, access to clean water, access to clean energy, financial inclusion, as it can finance and disseminate innovation in these sectors. So you may wonder, for example, how women and climate adaptation are connected. I give you an example in access to clean water, how it's interconnected. And by the way, access to clean water is today clearly underfunded by most of impact funds. But if you look at who is responsible for collecting water, it's very often women. They spend a lot of time collecting it and boiling it, and it leads to lost opportunities in education and pay world. On top of it, they often rely on fossil fuel to boil water. It has a negative effect on CO2 emission and women's health. So specifically, as Beyond Finance, we are looking at business models affordable, such as water filters and water kiosks. And I think we believe it really connects women and climate adaptation solutions. But you may wonder, what is our contribution as impact investor? How do we plan to transform really the sector? And we believe that financing these sectors is actually a very important step. But we want to go beyond the bridging a financing gap. And we really want to have a transformative ambition for our investees and really drive them to unlock the value of gender lens. And we are specifically looking at 2 dimensions, which were mentioned earlier, products and leadership. Products, because we believe it's really important to identify specific women's needs when it's come to climate adaptation. What are the needs in product and services? Where the market studies performed to understand the needs of this female customer? Are there enough women in product design, in client-facing position to listen to women customers and get feedback? That's actually an important question. And leadership, empowering women. Can we drive more women in leadership and management position? And we do that by a combination of technical assistance and KPI linked loans.
Thank you, Maud. That's indeed incredibly powerful what you said about putting the women we want all to serve with our finance at the center of the action when we design products or when we think about leadership. And with this, let me pass to our last but not least panelist, Jeannette Gurung. Jeannette is the founder and executive director of WOCAN, a network that supports women empowerment and gender integration. Jeannette is the creator of the W+ standard to measure, quantify, and monetize women's empowerment outcomes through the use of a market and results-based financing. Jeannette, pleasure to have you with us today. And the first question for you is, what was the rationale for creating W+ credits, and what are the opportunities associated with capturing and selling gender co-benefits? Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Demetrio. And I must just say that I'm so thrilled that CPI Convergence have now taken this on, gender and climate finance, in a very serious way. This has taken us a long time to get to this point, so it's a wonderful trend that's starting now. We started this in 10 years ago, in 2014. WOCAN is Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture, Natural Resource Management. We are a global network. We're a not-for-profit. So we have about 3 decades of experience providing technical services for gender mainstreaming, right? So that meant developing gender action plans, capacity building for gender mainstreaming for private and public organizations engaged in climate sectors. And these could be research bodies, world agencies, World Bank, etc. At some time about 10 years ago, about reflecting backwards, we realized that this focus on gender mainstream is not having the desired impact. So I know the focus here is gender mainstream. I think we've moved a long ways, but 10 years ago, looking back on it, we said, this is not working because there are not enough carrots or sticks. And there's too little accountability to get these organizations engaged in climate sectors, which are traditionally male-dominated, still are male-dominated sectors, to make the kind of changes that are needed. So we thought we need a completely different approach. Let's not just provide technical assistance for mainstreaming. Let's find a way to incentivize the kind of change that we're looking for. We looked at carbon markets and carbon standards as a model for this, because it was using a market-based approach that was allowing projects to go step by step, which is, I think, what Anne-Marie has also mentioned, the need to meet projects and companies and investors where they are, to allow them to build experience in gender outcome generation, and also have a design framework to do so, because we find that's the other thing that's missing. There's a lot of good intentions, but a lot of people who don't even know where to start. So noting that there are other ways to provide incentives through, as we've mentioned as well, performance-based metrics and things like this, but we chose specifically to use a kind of a market-based approach. That's number one. Number two, we felt there's a need for more rigor, accountability, and ambition. As we were coming up with our own standard, we were reviewing other standards, which is a process we've continued to do over these last 10 years. The other standards out there, even the ones that are claiming to be measuring gender, they are not rigorous enough in our estimation. They are using self-reporting. They're not using evidence. They're still doing head counting, box checking, and often they don't even provide a baseline study as part of the process. So if you don't have a baseline, how can you talk about the % of change that's occurred and that can be attributed to a project activity? So we feel very strongly that there need to be a move away from output-based reporting to outcome-based reporting. And I think we may have coined the term pink washing, which is also called maybe impact washing. We now see this kind of as a potential risk, headline risk to investors who choose to use gender metrics that are not rigorous enough. So also understanding it's not easy and that we need to start with where they are, but we've got to have this ambition to get people to look at outcome measurements, which is also a trend within impact investing. So it's not out of the norm. We needed, in order to monetize, as I'll tell you about in a minute, the outcomes, we needed a methodology that converts the change from baseline to results into a unit that could be monetized. So this takes me to the third reason that we created the W+ standard, which was really at the heart of who WOCAN is. It is WOCAN's theory of change that women-led cooperatives, women's organizations, not limited to women entrepreneurs and women-led enterprises, but that these have immense potential to address changes and climate-related changes, poverty, and other things, but they receive incredibly low level of funding. I would say almost non-existent funding for women's collectives that provide key and yet completely uncompensated services in the sectors of agriculture, natural resource management, and even energy. So we believe that the investment into these organizations is key to addressing these kind of huge global problems of the world. And I'll say right now that although women and girls, it was mentioned in the study that women and girls are the intended direct beneficiaries of only 2% of all climate-related deals and beneficiaries for 11% of those deals. And then I would say that only about 1% of that money comes down to women's organizations. So it's really, we should be screaming from the rooftops. The way we see these women are providing essential services for climate-related mitigation adaptation. So not as necessarily the victims of climate change. Yes, of course, they're vulnerable to all sorts of climate-related changes, but they're also providing services that are uncompensated. And so we were inspired by the carbon market system as an existing financial mechanism that's outcome-focused, evidence-based, and meant to reward those actors that enact changes that contribute to climate mitigation. And we saw this as a way to provide fundings to these organizations, to the projects and companies that can enable and increase the activities and the measurement of those outcomes, and also critically to reward women and women's organizations by providing them results-based payments of these contributions they're making to climate mitigation. So we use the architecture of the carbon standards to develop the W+ standard, which has nothing to do with carbon. We are just measuring women's empowerment. What we did differently from the carbon standards is we require a benefit sharing mechanism. So we said that at least for this time being, at least 20% of the revenue from the sale of a W+ credit must flow directly as a cash payment into the coffers of the women's organizations, collectives, and that money is for them to use as they see best fit to do so. Now, 99% of the time, the things that women are going to choose to spend that money on could be termed climate adaptation, since it is so broad, I think, as Maud also mentioned. So that's what the W+ standard is, and the W+ credits. The last thing I'll say about this, the W+ generates W+ credits that are what we would call standalone social impact credits. There's also a kind of a market developing for social impact credits. It's not nearly as big as the environmental markets, of course, but because of that reason, we also can tag or stack a W+ credit onto a carbon credit. And this is what I think this is much more familiar to buyers and investors in the environmental world, environmental markets. It's something they understand well, that idea of payment for results. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Jeannette, and really congrats for the incredible work you and the team are doing at WOCAN and the level of innovation there. Now, we are over time, so I will ask you the second round of questions, but I will really also ask you to try to keep your answer short, to give the possibility to the participants to ask you very important questions. And I will start from you, Jeannette, because you already elaborate actually a bit about it. My second question to you, Jeannette, is what has been the appetite from investors and carbon credit buyers until today for W+ credits, and what role can blended finance play in developing demand for this market? Thanks for your answer and brevity.
Thanks for the question. If by appetite you mean interest, it's super high. As the awareness starts to build over understanding what about the W+ standard, the W+ credits, everybody's interested in it. It's linking, as I said, linking it to carbon is really catching on by companies, by buyers of carbon credits who are now looking for gender co-benefits onto a carbon credit. We are an existing methodology for that. ESG investors see the value in the generation of credits as a social asset. So there's companies see value in linking their SDG targets to net zero mechanisms. So another way we can integrate gender and climate very concretely in a buyer market model. Buyers also like the added requirement of the revenue sharing with local communities in a way that surprised me, that companies want to see that they make concrete contributions, that there's transparent fund flow to. But I have to say that when you come to the purchases of those W+ credits, we are not where we would like to be. The growth of the market side has not kept pace with this high interest. So project developers, there have been sales of the standalone credits. There is interest in the ones with carbon. However, what's happening is we do not yet have any of those credits for sale because the carbon project developers are sitting on the fence, waiting for the market price, the market indication of what will that pricing premium be, what's on top of the carbon credit, and they need to know this. And so this is a bit of the research that I think needs to happen. So we have a market scoping and we have a market pricing for what that premium is. So that's one, I think, aspect that could be for the blended finance. Also, of course, grants. I think the ideal thing that would kick off this market would be if buyers would order credits in advance, pre-purchase. This is done in the carbon markets. This allows the buyers also determine what type of projects they want, they can also have some influence over the project design of these projects. It would also provide the funding upfront that could be used for measurement and the indicators for this. There's also need for capacity building for learning how to measure this, using how to use W+ standard. Capacity building for our dream is to see that women's organization and businesses themselves start to measure carbon. Why don't we have women-owned businesses becoming carbon project developers? That's a great source of revenue. We don't need to see women at the end of the supply chain all the time. They can, in fact, be in charge of determining what these climate projects look like. So I'll stop there. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, very interesting. And Maud, I'm going to you again for the second question. Thanks for your also brevity in advance. How does Behind Finance use technical assistance and financial incentives to support investees linking gender and climate goals?
Yeah, thank you, Demetrio. As a matter of fact, from a pure blended finance perspective, we tick many boxes, right? As you said, technical assistance, but also KPI link loans, that's a financial incentive. I'd like to acknowledge the fact we have received grants from Convergence as well, and the Indo-Pacific window and the gender responsive climate finance window. And we would certainly not be there without this very valuable support. To answer your question, Beyond Finance is meant to be a unique transformative private debt fund where we leverage on women to accelerate climate adaptation. So as you understand, it goes really beyond simply financing key sectors, even if we finance a couple of key sectors: sustainable agri, access to clean water, access to clean energy, but also financial inclusion to help disseminate innovation. You need actually to be able to catalyze a transformation and really driving investees to design better products for climate adaptation and by taking account women's needs and also empowering women. So to achieve that, we are using two mechanisms which really go hand in hand, and I think it's really important to emphasize it. Technical assistance, it's very helpful to create a baseline to understand the needs of women in climate adaptation solution. But then when you have understood the needs of women, you need actually to design product and services which will be suited to these women's needs. You need to support companies to roll out the products. And I guess you have also to identify the main gaps in the gender lens, right? Is it the management? Is it at the board level? Is it in client-facing role? Is it in design of solutions? So technical assistance is very helpful. And to really catalyze this change, we have also designed a mechanism of KPI-linked loan, which is something that you may have seen in other contexts. Think of sustainability-linked loan. It's the same mechanism, but applied to a private debt context. And I'm actually happy to mention that we are able to build up on the track record of our implementing partner, as they're actually a pioneer in using KPI linked loan. For example, they did it in India with a microfinance institution, and it drove really solar energy products and improvement of housing in areas prone to typhoons, as well as developing entrepreneur skills for women. Maybe a main point here is that KPI linked loan and technical assistance, for us, it's really deeply connected. It really goes hand in hand. TA will support the identification of gender and climate target and help companies to achieve them. And the KPI linked loan, it's really a way to incentivize companies of achieving these goals. And we are really hoping that the combination of these two mechanisms will accelerate the transformation and leverage on women to develop proper climate adaptation solutions.
Oh, very, very important indeed. Thanks, Maud. And I'm going to you, Anna-Marie, again, second question. Thanks for brevity. What has been FinDev's experience supporting investees to integrate gender outcomes across the energy sector, energy on grids versus off grids? And what has been the value of technical assistance here?
Thanks, Demetrio. And yeah, maybe just to be brief, I'll focus perhaps more on the kind of on-grid, because I think, maybe to be complementary to what Jeannette and Maud have been talking about. So really talking maybe about on-grid large-scale, let's say renewable energy projects in very male-dominated industries, which involve, greenfield projects involving, let's say, construction. So, which are perceived as more challenging, and not just, maybe it's not just a perception, but actually I was going to say that generally our experience has been positive, or perhaps more positive than one would think, looking at some of the characteristics of these sectors. There's generally openness from clients. And in my experience, the issue is not so much resistance as much as not knowing where to start, right? There can be this perception that working on gender equality is very complicated, or maybe that it's not material to the business, right? So, we're doing solar or wind. Why do we need to care about this? So when we come in and take the time to sit down with them, understand where they are, to my earlier point, and explain how we could support them, sometimes through TA, then the reception, typically is warmer, and at least there's interest and openness. And so, as I've just said, technical assistance is a crucial tool in our toolbox for this. But it's not the only one. I think in our experience, and even I think the greatest predictors of success, including TA or even outside TA, are often intentionality, and if there's capacity and resources, so accountability, the accountability mechanism. So is the company or the client actually going to dedicate resources to this? Is there someone's name attached to, carrying out the actions in the gender action plan? So that when we couple this with technical assistance, we've had, very interesting successes. Again, playing the long game doesn't mean that they got gender parity the next month, but again, I think small steps can yield interesting results. And I had some examples, but I'll stop now in the spirit of brevity.
Thank you, Anna-Marie. And again, last but not least, the last question to you, Las. What has been GGC's experience to date implementing gender action plan with investees and borrowers, and what are the main challenges they face? To you, and then to the participants who already asked a number of questions to all of you in the chat. Las, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you. So in the interest of being brief, I would say that our experience to date has been that our client base kind of falls into two camps. One is they're relatively sophisticated and have already borrowed or have had access to financing from some DFI in the past, and so are more sensitized towards this already in terms of the needs that they need to meet. And they might have a gender action plan in place already, for example, and so on. those guys are easier to deal with in so much as that they're already on the journey. Having said that, from a climate perspective, sometimes there are tweaks that we need to make to try and to get everyone to align, particularly with our criteria. And then the second camp is kind of the camp that Anne-Marie was talking about, which is where there's not, they haven't had any experience working with development finance institutions. They're not resistant to taking on a gender action plan and investing in gender equity within their business. But again, you have to go through that journey of explaining the value to them of doing so. And again, just to echo, what Anne-Marie and my other colleagues in the panel have said, TA is essential to helping that, because if there's a perception that this is going to be very expensive for them, they just don't want to do it, right? Because typically they're already working on very thin margins in their minds, and so it's really hard for them to make that exception. And one of the things that GGC benefits from is that we went through the CPI's Global Lab for Climate Innovation Finance, Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, and they helped us design a technical assistance facility, which I'm glad to say a donor is anchoring. I'm not allowed at this moment because the money's not in the bank, so to speak, yet as to let you know who it is. But they are anchoring this TA facility to allow us to support the second camp sort of clients that we're dealing with. So I would echo really the importance of having TA, and access to TA is a key part of helping people transition on this journey.
Thank you, Las. And it's a bit unfortunate we do not have much time left for the question and answers that are coming. Convergence and CPI team will be reverting back to the questions that now live we cannot address because of lack of time. So I will just ask you actually to Ayesha. Ayesha will end back to you to see if we can accommodate one question or how we move ahead. Back to you, Ayesha. And finally, really my thanks to all of you. It has been really a very exciting and interesting panel from my side. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Demetrio, and thank you to all of our panelists. I know that we only have about 2 minutes left, so what we'll do is we have the answers in the chat, so we'll try to go through it via email and follow up with our panelists if there are any specific asks from them. So thank you very much to our panel. We really appreciate your leadership work in this field, and this information has been very valuable. So I'll just spend a minute just to give some closing remarks to the group. As many of you know, this was the first report that we've done for the Learning Hub, but we do intend to focus on a number of different topics within the climate finance sphere, so gender and energy being one of the first topics that we focused on. So just a reminder that as the Hub continues, we'll be continuing to look across the climate finance ecosystem and speaking with many practitioners to better inform what research topics we want to work on. One of our goals is also to work more with Southern-based researchers, recognizing that they possess very deep expertise on local markets. So later this year, we will be putting out a call for proposals to local research organizations to help us address research topics. So that will come out later this year, but please do take a look at our website. I'll drop it in the chat as it's recently been launched for the Learning Hub, but that is part of our future ambition. So thank you to everyone for taking the time to join, and please do send any follow-up questions through to the Convergence email, and we can make sure that you get responses. So thank you all very much. In the interest of time, I'll close out the presentation now. Thank you very much.